Hey everyone, Sam here, otherwise known as FPL Pricey, and in today's video I'm going to take a look at 6 overlooked FPL picks that are starting to come into the conversation over the last week or two. So I'll be running the rule on all of them and figuring out whether or not they are good pickups in FPL ahead of game week 4. In the meantime, if you could leave a like and subscribe to the channel, that'd be greatly appreciated. For now though, let's crack on with it. Before we do get into it, just a quick reminder that all of the data today is provided by Fantasy Football Hub. They are extending their 50% off offer, so if you wanted to make use of that, then the link is in the description below. In the meantime though, let's talk about Nicholas Jackson to start off with, and he is a player that is being significantly overlooked so far, but I have seen one or two managers start to mention him as an FPL option over the coming weeks. And if we look at the fixtures first off, it is clear to see why Chelsea players are going to be popular over the next few weeks. There are 4 green fixtures on the ticker. Obviously, the colour of the fixture doesn't dictate how difficult or easy it is for a team, but it does go some way to show that maybe they are on the more favourable side. Bournemouth and West Ham, 2 away games to start off, but not too bad away games. You would think that there are goals in those games for Chelsea, followed by 2 decent home games against Brighton and Nottingham Forest. Overall, it's not a bad run. It does seem to end in game week 8, of course, when they play Liverpool away from home, who have been very difficult to break down so far. But 4 game weeks, nevertheless, to take advantage of the Chelsea attackers. The problem with Chelsea in general so far this season is, besides Palmer and, of course, Jackson, who we're going to come on to, it's been very difficult to figure out who their starting 11 is going to be and who we can trust week in, week out to get the minutes to get us those attacking returns in hopefully 90 minutes a match rather than 50 or 60 and then getting subbed off pretty quickly. Or, in Nkunku's case, not even starting at all. Nicholas Jackson is a player that's defying that problem though, and he seems to be the player that they're trusting to start up front in that number 9 role week in, week out. And at 7.6 million, if you've got yourself a pretty nailed down Chelsea attacker for this run, it should be pretty good value for money as well. A quick note on Nicholas Jackson, he started the season pretty well too, 2 goals, 1 assist. And the data is really strong too. Now, this data correlates pretty well with the data we saw last season for Jackson that was up and above. I think it was consistently above 0.6 XG per 90 across the season, even without penalties. And it's even better so far this season as well. So it's looking strong. He is a player that gets a lot of chances. He's also, unfortunately, a player that historically has flashed at a lot of chances and maybe not buried quite as many as we might want or expect. He can be a little bit frustrating to own, or at least that's what we know of him from his first season in the Premier League. He's a young striker. He's going to hopefully get better. He's been putting in a lot of hours on the training ground at Cobham, or so we've been told, of course. And hopefully that goes to show in the start of the season he's had, but also will continue in the next 4 or 5 game weeks. The expected points are looking really good over the next 5 as well, over 5 points per game on average that we're expecting. And the ownership's pretty low too. He is pretty differential. So this is a player that if you back the minutes and you think that he continues to start games up front for Chelsea, I really see no reason why not to recommend him, especially if we take the logic that season on season, a player of his ability will continue to improve in front of goal and will hopefully become more of a consistent finisher over time. I think the key question here is whether or not he's a better player to have in your teams than the likes of an Ollie Watkins, an Alexander Isak or a Kai Havertz over this stretch of fixtures. And I think he is a player that you could challenge those players with. Now, Watkins is getting limited minutes at the moment, 60, 70 per game, and also hasn't really looked like burying too many chances recently either. The fixtures are good though. Kai Havertz has 2 pretty tough games coming, but after that, really good games. So maybe you could do something with Jackson for a couple of weeks, followed by Kai Havertz after that. And then Alexander Isak on penalties. The data's not there yet, but you'd expect it to improve. So for what it's worth, I think Jackson is definitely in the conversation around that price point with the other challengers. I don't know if he's done quite enough just yet for me to put him ahead of the likes of Isak, for example, or Kai Havertz, but he's a little bit cheaper than them. So if you're looking for that extra 0.4 or 0.9 spare over the likes of Isak or Kai Havertz, Jackson could be a really good way into the Chelsea attack, and Palmer is the only other consistent attacker that we can rely on in that Chelsea attack. He comes in 3 million more expensive than Jackson and takes up a valuable midfield slot. So whether or not he can cover Palmer is a whole different matter. Don't think he can, but he's a good asset in his own right, and maybe he should be a player that we're considering over the next few weeks. So moving on to one of only a handful of players to have returned in each of the first 3 game weeks individually, and that is Antoine Semenyo. Now, 2 goals, 1 assist in the opening 3 is a great return. But what encourages me even more than that is the attacking underlying data so far for Semenyo. 0.4 XG per 90 and 0.43 XA per 90 is absolutely incredible, especially for a midfielder priced at 5.6 million. Even if he had half of that, he would probably still be good value for money at that price point. So, why isn't he in more teams? Well, 4.8% of teams, it is rising slowly, and he has had a price rise up to 5.6 million. So he's a little bit more expensive than he started the game at, but still very, very good value for money. And with the next run of fixtures coming, I think there are attacking returns yet to come for him too. So Chelsea have looked pretty open at the back so far. They haven't looked defensively solid. I don't think that that's a bad fixture for Bournemouth at all. Liverpool, yes, granted, if you can have him benched for that game week, that would be amazing, because Liverpool aren't letting in many chances at the moment. But the 2 game weeks after that, Southampton and Leicester are 2 of the weakest defences in the league. So I think 3 out of the next 4 are definitely attackable for a player like Semenyo. And again, at 5.6 million, you could hide him on your bench for game week 5 and game week 8 against Arsenal at home, and you're probably not too worried about that. In fact, I would go as far as to say that it's not even a complete nightmare if you had a bit of an injury crisis in either of those weeks and you had to rely on him to start. He is one of the talismanic figures at Bournemouth at the moment. They have created a lot of chances so far this season already, with not the easiest run of fixtures as well, it has to be said. It's just whether or not he's going to continue to be this talismanic figure for Bournemouth in the absence of Solanke. Now they've got a new striker in situ. Is that going to shift the power balance a little bit over the next few weeks? And as they bed in the new players, is Semenyo's power going to wither slightly? Now, I would argue that it's unlikely that it will wither so far that he's not going to be good value for money at 5.6 million. And especially by game week 6 and game week 7, I can only really see Bournemouth getting stronger. And I think it will be a good idea to jump on Bournemouth assets around about that time. Whether or not you want to do it now is up for debate, because obviously it depends how bad you think that Chelsea fixture is. But at home, when Chelsea are under new management, they're still conceding plenty of chances, and Bournemouth have looked strong in an attacking sense at the very least so far this season. I think it's definitely a fixture that you don't have to worry about. And if you're on a wild card this week, I think he's probably the 5.5, 5.6 million asset of choice right now. And I'd have no hesitation in recommending him ahead of the likes of even potentially a Smith Rowe or a Minte if you're looking at more of a long-term pick. He's much more talismanic than either of those figures at the moment. The data is better than either of those players at the moment as well, and he's more bedded in with the side. So I do think he's going to be a player that is going to catch our attention by game week 6 for certain. Whether or not you want to jump on him early and hopefully ride a couple of price rises if he does return against Chelsea, that could be a good option for you. I really like him. Let me know in the comments below what you think of him as well. I'm also seeing a lot more conversation happening in the community around Dominic Calvert-Lewin. And he is a player that in the past, maybe we've had our hesitations about due to injury. However, it is worth noting that last season, I think he started 29 Premier League games. And of course, he's been starting this season as well. So potentially we need to readjust our focus on Calvert-Lewin and maybe stop picturing him as someone who breaks down every other week. He's been a lot more consistent fitness-wise than maybe I had in the back of my mind going into this season. So perhaps we need to change our attitude towards him. However, I want to give a balanced and fair argument on all of these players. These are not just players I recommend. These are players that have been overlooked but are coming into conversation, and I want to give a balanced argument on them all. And I have to say that even at his price point at 5.9 million, I'm not sure I can fully endorse Calvert-Lewin just yet. The reason for that is whilst he has returned twice, was in one game, and that was a pretty hectic, crazy game against Bournemouth. I've already talked about Bournemouth from an attacking point of view, but they did give up a lot of chances to Everton. So whether or not we want to evaluate Calvert-Lewin based on that one performance, especially when the underlying data so far hasn't been that impressive, 0.14 XG per 90 for a striker isn't really that stunning. It's not something that I'd even look twice at this point in time. And whilst fixtures beget form and they've got a decent run coming, I also don't think it's as good as maybe the colours on the fixture ticker you might see on the FPL app would suggest. Away from home for the next two against Aston Villa and Leicester. Leicester will be targetable, but away obviously isn't as good as at home. Crystal Palace and Newcastle at home after that. Okay, 2 home games, that's pretty decent, but Newcastle aren't poor defensively. Crystal Palace were decent defensively last season as well. I'm just not sure at 5.9 million he's the player I would pick at that price point ahead of the likes of João Pedro, Yohan Wissa, and also Muniz and Wood as well are hovering around that sort of price. I'm just not sure I can endorse Calvert-Lewin even with those fixtures to come. And again, I just wanted to give a balanced argument because he has been spoken about a little bit more. And maybe at 1.8% ownership, he will be that differential that if you pick him at the right time will help you soar up the ranks. And again, the fixtures are decent, so perhaps it is a good time to do so. But based on the data so far, I think it would take a little bit more evidence for me to fully endorse this pick at this point in time. So Leif Davis is another player I've got mixed feelings about ahead of this next few games because of the fixture difficulty ranking on the FPL app. Now, if you go over to the FPL app, you'll probably see mostly a sea of green across the next 6 or 7 fixtures. And I do agree to an extent that they are decent fixtures on paper, but it is worth remembering that Ipswich are a promoted side, and whilst I think we all kind of suspect that they're going to be one of the stronger promoted sides and McKenna is a very good manager, these fixtures to come are still not amazing for a side like Ipswich. Now, 4 away games in the next 6 game weeks. The 2 home games are against Aston Villa and Everton, so I'd say Aston Villa's a tough game. Everton's an easier game, but again, Everton will also view that fixture as a winnable match. And the other fixture in the next 6 that I'd probably objectively put as green in terms of Ipswich's ability would be Southampton away from home. Now, Southampton will also view that as a side that they want to beat at home, so that will also be a competitive game. So I don't think we can get carried away about the fixtures that Ipswich have got over the next 5 or 6 weeks, but they're also not bad. They are avoiding some of the biggest sides, so maybe this is a time to look at a player like Leif Davis. 4.5 million and only 1.7% owned. He will be an incredible differential pickup if he produces anything like the attacking threat that we saw of him in the Championship. Now, we've already seen him get 1 assist so far this season. That was last week against Fulham, so we know he's capable of it. Although it is worth noting that that was a pretty nothing pass around the halfway line across to Delap, who then ploughed forward and broke the lines of Fulham to score. So I wouldn't really call it the kind of assist that we'd expect from Leif Davis week in, week out. But at least he's up and running, and at least he's got himself an assist so far. I think the fixtures to come are good enough that we can expect another couple of assists. Whether or not we can also back Ipswich to get defensive returns, that being clean sheets over the next 5 or 6 game weeks, I'm not so sure. We might be able to get 1 or 2 out of them, but I think it's fair to say that with a pick like Davis in mind, we're hoping more on the assist threat than we are clean sheets. The data's not bad so far, but it's not electric. But then again, 2 of the opening 3 game weeks were against Liverpool and Man City, so you're not really expecting much anyway. So if you're picking Leif Davis, and I was tempted to pick him as well around this point in time, you're kind of hoping that that data will improve, and you're taking a punt on the fact that he will be just as creative as he was in the Championship, and he will continue to be one of Ipswich's chief outlets in attack in the coming weeks. For a defender to be that involved in the way that a team builds up from an attacking point of view is very rare, and Davis at 4.5 million could be a really good budget pickup if he is as reliable as he was for attacking returns last season. So Bryan Mbeumo has rightly got all of the attention in the last couple of game weeks. He's on penalties, he will be talismanic for Brentford, and he's at a good price in midfield too. Of course, getting the haul against Southampton really helped. But one player that has recently started being talked about a little bit more is Yoane Wissa. Now, Wissa won't take the headlines in the same respect that Mbeumo will, because one, he's positioned as a forward in FPL, 2, he's not on penalties, and 3, he is a bit more of a minutes risk than Mbeumo is. He does tend to get taken off more regularly than Mbeumo does, but he is undoubtedly in Brentford's strongest starting 11, and his history of returns, especially when Tony isn't in the side, is also really, really strong. His data so far this season has been incredible too, 0.73 XG per 90. It is worth noting, a little asterisk on that one of the goals scored was an incredibly high XG chance. So that is kind of skewing the data a little bit in the early game weeks. So let's not get too carried away. It probably will regress a little bit. But the data historically was still very good. So whilst it will come down a bit, I still expect Wissa's data to be decent, especially at his price at 6.1 million. Again, like a couple of players I've mentioned in this video, he has had a price rise, but in and around this price point, I think he is one of the strongest assets around about now. Now, 23.3 points in the next 5, so he's averaging, you would hope, around 5 points a game. And I think that's especially important to note, considering the next 2 games are against Man City away and Spurs away. Spurs less so, but Man City, you're not really expecting so much from him in an attacking sense. So really, a lot of those points are going to be skewed towards game week 6, 7 and 8, maybe a little bit towards 5 as well. So it's more about timing on a player like Wissa or Mbeumo. A lot of people have been talking about this anyway, but I honestly don't really hate it. If you're on a wild card right now, or you're looking to make a transfer, maybe you're sick of the likes of Adam Armstrong, for instance, and you're a little bit worried about João Pedro getting back from international duty later than most, and maybe a little bit worried about minutes, I really don't have that much of a problem with going for Wissa a couple of game weeks early. Maybe you could just store him on your bench if you don't have high hopes for him this week. But from game week 5 onwards, even away at Spurs, I think that is a perfectly fine game to be starting your Brentford attackers in. And if I was looking at Mbeumo, he would be a definite start in that game. So with the data that Wissa's got, why aren't we considering him in the same breath or in the same context as an Mbeumo? The penalties do matter, of course, but for 1 million less, and the data that he's been getting so far, and he's also not taking up a midfield spot where there are tons of really strong options, I really do like Wissa, and if I was on a wildcard this week, I would be considering him, perhaps to store on the bench for 1 game week, but after that to be a regular starter in my 11. And he's certainly a player that I'm interested in transferring in if I'm not going to wildcard in game week 6. Certainly with a free transfer that week, he will be an option. And if I am on a wildcard, which is looking likely, he's definitely in consideration to be in my 15. The final player I wanted to talk about today is a popular one. That is Kevin De Bruyne. 11% owned, so he's one of the higher owned players in the video today. And I still think he has been overlooked, but the conversation has shifted a little bit now, and he is becoming more of a popular pick. However, I did want to talk about him in a balanced way today. I'm not just going to say go out and pick him, because there are positives and negatives to him as an FPL pick this season. To start with the positives, the data so far is fantastic, and he does look like he's come straight back from the summer, fit and firing, and looking like a top asset once again. As I said, data absolutely incredible. 0.96 XGI per 90. That's without penalties as well. For a midfielder under 10 million, absolutely incredible if he continues at that sort of rate. 1 goal, 1 assist so far is decent, maybe a tad underperforming so far, but you'd expect that to balance out over the next few game weeks. And over the next 5 fixtures, he's expected to score almost 6 points per game. Now, that is based on the idea that he will continue to get 90 minutes per match. I'm not so sure that that will continue to be the case. Now, on to the negatives, perhaps. He does have 2 more difficult games in the next 5. Arsenal at home in game week 5 is not a fantastic fixture, of course, considering Arsenal's defensive capabilities. And then going up to St James's Park away at Newcastle, objectively, isn't an easy game. Now, if I'm spinning it back to positive skew for a second, against Arsenal, he has a good track record. I remember him scoring a good couple of goals against them. And he does have a reputation, or a bit of a nickname in the community as Big Game Kev. So he does usually tend to turn up in these kind of matches. Not really a scientific method to it there, but it is worth noting that he does seem to be a big game player. So perhaps those 2 fixtures in game week 5 and 6 are not as bad as they look on paper. However, what we do have to take into consideration is the fact that Man City are a Champions League side once again, of course, and they will have to start playing midweek fixtures in the Champions League from game week 4 onwards. So after game week 4 against Brentford is out of the way, they'll have a midweek fixture before Arsenal. They'll have a midweek fixture a lot of weeks after that. I think, in fact, 8 midweeks they are going to play at the very least. You'd also expect them to qualify, so it's going to go on longer than that. So it's just whether or not Kevin De Bruyne is going to consistently start matches and get regular 80-plus minute appearances in the Premier League after the Champions League kicks in. A player of his age, I would expect that he does get rested every now and then. That might happen in the Champions League when they're playing a weaker opposition, but it could also happen when you don't want it to in the Premier League when they've got an easier fixture. Let's say Fulham in game week 7, for instance. They could easily go into that game thinking, okay, we can maybe rest De Bruyne that week. We've got Foden, we've got Bernardo Silva, we've got Gundogan as well now, who can also play in that role. All of these players can cover for him for 1 week if he needs a rest. And I think that is where my hesitation would lie on Kevin De Bruyne at the moment. Yes, he's fantastic. No one is arguing that when he's on the pitch in that central role, he's going to continue to get chances and create chances, more importantly, for one of the world's best strikers, if not the best striker in the world right now. But it's whether or not he's going to regularly get the minutes that we require of him to be value for money at 9.6. I personally don't think we can go there at the moment. The reason for that is because Gundogan will start getting starts pretty soon. He's just come back into the fold. But once he's up and running and once he's gotten a few more training sessions under his belt, you'd expect him to be challenging for starts. And we haven't even seen the likes of Phil Foden yet, who's been really struggling with an illness, but he will inevitably come back in eventually, and he will be challenging for that central role as well. So I do think that Kevin De Bruyne has had an easier start to the season in terms of challenges to his throne in the middle of the pitch. He will be starting games. He didn't have midweek fixtures. He hasn't had that competition. But from this point onwards, it's going to become a lot more competitive for Man City, and I do see him getting his minutes managed just a little bit more from here on out. He will still get the odd haul, so he's still maybe a good pick every now and then, but I don't know if I could reliably trust upon him to start games week in, week out and continue being value for money at 9.6 million when at that price point we're looking at so many other good assets, and even below his price point, other assets at 8.5, 7.5, 7 million that could arguably challenge his points total over the next 5 or 6 game weeks. As we reach the end of today's video, please do remember to leave a like and subscribe to the channel if you enjoyed the show. And if there are any other overlooked players that you'd like me to talk about, do feel free to leave a comment below. I'll see you next time as we start running through my transfer plans ahead of game week 4.